Welcome to the Divorce Podcast, where we explore all aspects of ending relationships, separation, and parenting apart. If your marriage or partnership has ended, or you have friends and family who are separating, this podcast is for you. I'm Kate Daly, a relationship counsellor, divorce specialist, and co-founder of Amicable, the online legal service for separating couples. In each episode, we look at relationships and separation from different angles, including the emotional, legal, and social. I'm joined by experts and special guests who share their own unique stories, experience, and tips with the goal of helping people end relationships in a kinder and better way. In this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Samantha Gaines, head of the RSPCA's Companion Animals Science and Policy Department, and Carol Hart, divorce specialist at Amicable, to debunk myths around separating with pets and explore how you can help your pets navigate the transition. We explore some common misconceptions surrounding pet ownership in separation and important legal considerations, as well as the psychological impact on your pets if you separate. You can learn practical tips to help your pets adjust to their new living situation and get to know the warning signs if they're struggling. Plus, our experts share what to do if the worst comes to the worst and neither of you can care for your pet post-separation. If you loved this episode, then please subscribe and rate us on your preferred listening platform. Welcome, Carol, and welcome, Samantha.
Thanks for inviting me, Kate.
Thank you very much, Kate. Hi.
Hi both. It's lovely to see you both, and thank you very much for joining me. So just to set the scene a little bit for this episode, we often talk about children when we talk about navigating support, divorce and separation, but a really big part of family life now are pets and animals. So this episode is going to focus on the special arrangements and considerations you need to take when separating with a family pet. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the myths, and we're going to bust some myths about how you handle separation and divorce when pets are involved. So I'm going to start, if I may, with the first myth, which is it's commonly believed that whoever bought the pet gets to keep it in a divorce and separation. So, Carol, is that true?
Well, Kate, like many things in law, it's not as straightforward as that. The courts can take into consideration things like, who paid for the pet's care, who was the pet's main caregiver, and also what's in the best interest of the pet.
Yeah, and I guess until recently, it was kind of commonly understood that pets from a legal perspective were treated as what we call chattels. So just the same as, a posh painting or a piece of furniture or anything else when you're coming to divide money and property in a separation. But there was a really interesting case recently, and it made me laugh because it was, in cases when there's case law is released, they put the initials and it was FI versus DO. No pun intended. So Fido, essentially. But in this case, the judge looked at who had looked after the animal. And so I think it's changing, isn't it, in the way that the law looks at animals and what happens to animals in a divorce and separation.
Yeah, absolutely, because you've got to think of the impact to the family as well, especially if there's children involved, the impact of separating. And yeah, it was really interesting that the judge thought that was more important, who the dog saw was the main caregiver over who bought the dog. Which is a really nice step forward, I think.
And Samantha, one of the other myths we often come up against is only one partner would bond with a pet. It's kind of like this old-fashioned notion we used to have with children where there was a primary caregiver and that was the person who bonded with the child and nobody else got a look in. So the kind of thought was that the child went with the primary caregiver. That's a very old-fashioned way of looking at things. We don't look at things in that way with children. But is that different for animals or is it the same?
Well, I think one of the great things about dogs and why they make such fantastic family pets is the way in which they are so socially flexible. So because of the journey that we've taken dogs on with us through domestication, we actually find that dogs can make really strong bonds with lots of different people. So the idea of just having that one caregiver and that the dog has only made one solid attachment or strong bond with one individual really doesn't carry much weight anymore. But I think what's really interesting is that in some cases, it may well be the primary caregiver isn't necessarily the dog's most primary attachment. So in my case, as an example, I have a dog at home. My husband probably is her primary caregiver. He gives her all her walks, he feeds her. But when it comes to the person that she's most bonded to, it is myself. So I think, what's really important in all of this discussion is, we have an animal in the center of these, often quite difficult situations, and we have to be thinking about things from their perspective as well, and not just ours. And sometimes it's quite difficult, I think, having those conversations around who pets probably value the most.
Yeah, so that's interesting, isn't it? So, Carol, if you take what Sam's just said, that there might be quite a big difference between the person who administers the care and the person with whom the animal is bonded with primarily. How on earth do you sort that out when people are divorcing and separating? What sort of process do we take people through to try and uncover what's in the animal's best interest?
Yeah, I think it's starting with people's goals, what they want to get from the arrangements, and also looking at reality testing any proposals that they might come up with, and, talking about if they're proposing, for an example, a shared care arrangement where the dog, as an example of a pet, spends equal time with both pet parents, and you start digging a little bit deeper and one of them maybe works away or works long hours. How is that going to be for that dog? Is it going to be suitable for the dog to be left on their own for long periods of time? Probably not. So it's looking at goals, looking at options, and reality testing those options to get to a set of agreements.
So is that then a myth, Sam, that you can't share arrangements for pets? Is it possible to do shared care for things like dogs? I'm presuming we're talking about dogs a lot, aren't we? But I'm imagining it's quite different. If you've got a cat, you're probably not going to be sharing the care of a cat. But a dog that is more able to live in two homes, is a shared care arrangement a possibility?
It absolutely is a possibility. And in fact, I do have friends that have those exact arrangements for their dogs. So it does work really, really well. And I think the great thing again about dogs is that in the vast number of cases, they do adapt very, very well. They are amazing at picking up social cues. So they do learn very quickly. They can adapt to situations. But it does very much come down to the individual, because you will have some dogs that, for various different reasons, will find it much, much harder to cope. So I think with everything, there's never a one size fits all in these situations. It's about understanding the individual's personality. But you're absolutely right when it comes to cats. I think it's potentially a little bit more difficult having that sort of shared arrangement. And just for example, one of the reasons being is that cats typically find being transported really, really stressful. I think anyone who tries to take their cat to the vet would attest that. So you might not actually want to be in a situation where every fortnight or every month you're transporting your cat to an ex-partner's property. I think that potentially becomes very difficult, and you are likely to see some serious fallout for cats who do find that really stressful. So you might see increased marking in the home, for example, or real stark behaviour changes. So I think that's important in that, it is possible with individuals to be able to do those sorts of shared arrangements, but you have to know your animal as an individual and be really aware of what normal behaviour is, because that's often the first sign that something's not quite right for them, that they're finding it difficult to cope, and that you might then actually have to help them to make sure that they do find it that bit more easy to adapt.
That's an interesting point, isn't it? Because what's the difference between an animal taking a reasonable amount of time to adjust to a situation and an animal being unhappy and therefore you having to come back to the table to renegotiate care arrangements? How do you judge that line?
I think in general, if we were talking about most well-adjusted family dogs, then it may take them like a couple of days when they go somewhere completely new to settle in, because obviously they have to discover what is a new environment for them. There's lots of things that are unfamiliar, and they will want to build up a strong scent picture so that they understand what that environment is like for them. I think if you end up in a situation where you're seeing sort of like prolonged behavioural change, your dog is fear or anxious, that he's maybe not eating, then in those situations, we would always recommend that they seek veterinary help. And if there are no underlying health issues, they will often refer you to a behaviourist, because I think the one thing we've really got to appreciate for dogs especially is that they are little emotional sponges. So they absolutely mirror our emotions. And for anyone that is obviously going through a separation or a divorce, it's going to be incredibly difficult at times. And our dogs may well be highly sensitive to that. So we also have to be very mindful that how we're behaving and how we're feeling is likely to impact upon our dogs as well. So I think that's another important point to consider, that as we would with children, we need to be very careful around how we're behaving in these sorts of situations for our pets as well.
I think, Carol, you were telling me earlier, weren't you, that your dog had its own reaction, or her own reaction to when your partner left?
Yeah, so when we separated, my ex-partner moved too far away for us to have any shared care. So for Maisie, our dog, one of her caregivers was there one day and not the next. And it did take her a while to get used to it. Yeah, it took her a while, and she was quite grumpy at first, particularly with other dogs. And then, but now she's back to her usual self.
When a pet is adjusting, and when you're going through that separation yourself, how do you have those conversations with a partner, Carol? So, in the case that Sam was just saying, where it could be that the person who gives the care to the dog isn't necessarily the person that the dog is bonded with. That feels like quite a contentious issue to broach. So how do we do that in a way that keeps things, because animals are very emotional kind of topics, aren't they? So how do we keep that as a reasonable conversation with best interests at the heart of it, rather than it sort of exploding into a nasty argument?
Yeah, I find that bringing the focus back to your pet and their experience can take away from the conflict. So bring it back to, okay, so talk me through what the dog's experience is going to be with your proposal. And how do you think the dog will react to, what one person is saying? And you find that often with that, and with that sort of pet-centred conversation, the answers will come.
And another myth that we often hear is, it's only a pet. Only a pet. It will adjust to a new arrangement. Is that myth or is that reality, Sam?
I mean, I think the fact that we have so many pets that live amongst our households in the UK, again, is like testament that they are more than just a pet. For a lot of people, they are really valued, cherished family members. And so, they play a really important role for us as individuals. And, I think that, again, it is around individuals. Most pets, given time and support, will absolutely be able to adapt. But it's understanding and recognising that this potentially is going to be a stressful experience for them as well, whether, as like what Carol was just explaining, it's the absence of someone who a pet is very bonded to and values having that company, through to actually moving to a completely different new environment, potentially going out for different walks, meeting new dogs. I mean, it can be a completely life-changing event for the pet as well. So critical is really making sure that your pet's behaviour, looking out for anything that is abnormal, and if you are genuinely worried, seeking help. So the RSPCA has lots of advice and information on our website, and that can be hugely helpful in terms of what are normal behaviour signs for a dog or cat who is happy and relaxed, and then giving some advice around, what might you see if they're anxious, if they're worried, and when you should really seek help. And I think that, again, is key for people perhaps who think they might be going through this process, doing a little bit of preparation so that when it does become really, really difficult, you have already got a plan in place for your pet.
I think that's the key, isn't it? We always say that when we're talking about children, planning on how you're going to resolve matters, even if you don't know all the answers, but planning on how you're going to have some of these conversations is so important before an issue arises. Because if you've got a process mapped out that you're going to sit down with an expert, I mean, we have our separating with pet sessions at Amicable. If you already know that that's where you're going to go, if you hit the buffers, then that makes it a big difference, doesn't it? I think just the plan of knowing you've got someone to talk to is really important. As you say, it might be a vet, it might be looking at some online resources. Just going back to this notion that we're talking about pets, we're obviously focusing a little bit on dogs here, but with portable pets, so I don't know, the sort of rodents, the gerbils, the hamsters, those kind of things, are they okay to, if you've got kids, are they okay to move with the kids? So when the kids at mum's house, they're with mum, and when the kids are at dad's house, they're with dad or mum and mum or whoever. Are those portable pets portable in reality as well as in practicality?
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because we assume that because they're small and easy to relocate,
because we can, yeah,
because we can. But actually, I would say that in many cases, certainly for the small rodents, when we're talking about, as you say, sort of hamsters, gerbils, rats, mice, it can be incredibly stressful for them because with all of that movement is generally transport, and transport is a real stressor for animals. They find it very, very difficult to cope with. I think, again, it probably comes down to the frequency and the individual, but it's compounded in these sorts of pets because they are very subtle communicators. So it's actually very difficult to tell when they are feeling stressed or anxious or worried. And sometimes by the time you have realised, they can be quite ill. So, I think, again, it probably would be best for the pet to, or at least a small pet like that, actually just to stay in one place. And again, that understanding that that is what is best for that particular animal.
And another myth then, Carol, is that the court ultimately decides who gets the pet, the dog, usually, as where court proceedings tend to take place. Is that a myth or is that reality?
So in reality, the court don't get involved. Most people will come to an agreement privately or with a bit of help and support with somebody like me. If you find yourself in a situation where you're asking the courts to get involved, it can be a really long, drawn-out process, incredibly stressful, and it can cost a lot of money. So, I say to the people that I work with, if you do get to a point where you're asking the judge to tell you what to do, you're giving them complete control. And one of you or both of you might not like the outcome. So it's much better to come to these agreements yourself if you can without using the courts.
And what happens when you can't decide who the dog or the cat or whoever is most bonded to? How do you get past that? If you both want the animal, what are some of the options? We've talked a little bit about shared care. Is that the only option? Should we be considering one person going and getting another pet? Is that insensitive? How do you work that? You can't just replace the bond you've got with an animal, but is it an option for one person to say, okay, I will start again with a new relationship with a pet? Or
it's something to consider whether, the person that's getting the new dog is open to that is something that you can explore in your option sessions. It's hard, isn't it? Because when you have a dog and you love a dog or, a cat, etc., you want them 100% of the time because that's been your experience. So it's really hard to navigate those tricky discussions. But absolutely, yeah, all options are on the table to delve into.
And Sam, I'm sure in some cruddy American film, I've seen something where they try and decide who the dog should go with by doing the whole, we'll both call it and see who it comes to. Is that a reality? Am I being very obtuse here, or how can you decide?
I do know what film you mean. I think, again, that can be quite tricky. It can be quite context specific in terms of, where you actually do it. And I'm just thinking about if I did that with my dog and I was trying to get her to decide who she wanted to be with, whether it was me, my husband, or my 13-year-old daughter, I don't really know who she would choose. I think I expect she would choose me, but there are so many things that can sort of affect those decisions. And I think ultimately what is important is who can give your pet the best quality of life, because ultimately it's about making sure that your pet is happy. And it goes back to what we were saying earlier. It's like, who actually is going to potentially be at home during the day? If they're not at home during the day, who's going to have the finance to pay for additional care? Can they keep routines fairly similar to what they've experienced previously? Because that can be really helpful in reducing stress. So I certainly wouldn't advocate for putting a dog into a situation trying to make a decision, because actually probably be incredibly confusing for them and probably quite upsetting for those involved. But I think ultimately it's got to be who is going to be able to give them that best quality of life. And if they can share to achieve that, then all the better.
And another thing I just wanted to touch on as well, just if one of you obviously doesn't get the pet, the other one does, are there any extra considerations when there's already an existing pet relationship in one household and perhaps you've got children moving between two households? Are there additional considerations when getting a new pet in the second household? Are there things that you have to think differently about because there is already a relationship with a pet in house one, and then you've got another pet coming into the second home where the children are revolving between the two? Sam, is there anything from a sort of psychological perspective to be mindful of in that scenario?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really interesting one, because often what we find, certainly with dogs, is that there is a general belief that some dogs are friendly and some dogs are not friendly. And, we label certain types of dogs and certain types of breeds, especially, as being friendly. And I think, again, for perhaps children that have lived in a household with one dog that have got very certain expectations around that dog, may then think of any other dog that comes into another home as being exactly the same and they can do the same thing. And so it is again going back to that pet as an individual. What does that pet like, dislike? What are their preferences? What do they need to be happy? And just reminding children that, that they are different animals. And that sounds probably a little bit simple, but that absolutely is the case. And just being mindful, I think, as well, going back to that whole emotional sponge situation where, if there is tension for children moving between different homes, possibly because they're moving into a different house and there's a new family member there, whether that's person or not, again, animals pick up on that. So I think it's again making sure that everyone understands about giving animals space. If you've got a dog, creating somewhere that they can go where they feel nice and safe and can escape when things get a little bit heated or a little bit difficult.
It's interesting, isn't it, that whole idea of having multiple pets in multiple homes and how then you interact and what happens to the home and things. But Carol, what about people who perhaps have never had a pet or a dog in particular or a cat, and then the divorce is the point at which an animal is introduced into one or other of the homes? Are there some timing issues that you think people need to be mindful of in that scenario?
I think, you both need to be settled in your homes, okay, before you introduce a new pet. And depending on whether the pet's going to be permanent in one place or is going to go between households as well, that's something to consider. And training as well, because training, if it's a dog, training can take up a lot of time. So it's important to consider that. And if there's children involved, how they're going to be involved in the training.
Yeah, I always think of divorces, which has been a massive change, isn't it? And you've got a lot on your plate. You're emotionally adjusting. As you say, usually people are going into a smaller property. There aren't many people who divorce and go into a bigger property. You're going into a smaller property, potentially in a new area. You've got all of that kind of settling in to do yourself. It sometimes feels a bit of an additional ask to add a pet into that mix when everything yourself is so uncertain. So I was just wondering about that.
Yeah. And of course, you've got to think about the reality again, sort of talking about a dog. Are you able to take your dog out for walks? Are you able to give them, as Samantha was talking about, the quality of life that they deserve? It's kind of looking at it really realistically, because it's a huge responsibility and not to be taken lightly.
I think that's a really good point, actually, because I think it might well be that at that particular moment in time, you feel that that's the best time to bring a pet into your life because you want some companionship and you perhaps need something to do with perhaps more time that you've got. But from the pet's point of view, it can be an incredibly stressful time, obviously coming into a new home that's then compounded by a caregiver who's going through a lot of stress and trying to work through a lot of emotional turmoil as well. So I think absolutely giving it a little bit of period of time and just ensuring that you can give that pet everything that they all need is absolutely key.
I think it's that whole analogy. We talk about this on the podcast quite a bit about putting your own oxygen mask on first before moving on and helping somebody else. And it's the same with a pet, isn't it? If you need to invest time in your pet, and whether it's training or if it's a rescue dog, there could be all sorts of behavioural issues that you want to care and be there and be present for. to try and retrain. So I think you have to be in quite a good place yourself, and straight off the back of a divorce feels like a bit of a risky time to me. The final myth then is splitting up will ruin your pet's life. Myth or reality? Sam?
It really doesn't have to. I think it's, if it's done in a very thoughtful, considered way and, keeping that pet sort of very much sort of first and foremost in considerations of what's going to happen next, then it is absolutely possible to do it in a way without ruining their life. And actually, I think when I think of my friends that have got shared arrangements with their dogs have the most incredible life, because I think actually both caregiver goes to great lengths to give them everything that they can when they get to spend the time with them.
So in that sense, a bit of absence makes the heart grow fonder then. You're a bit more on it when it's your turn.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, they are very much committed to the time that they have for their dog when it is their turn. And so they will absolutely be at home. They will plan really exciting walks, things that they know that their dog will absolutely love. And they are there that, they're completely mindful in that situation of their dog.
It's like you say sometimes, don't we, with Carol, with parenting, you sometimes, when a divorce happens, it's very easy for people to say that it's all a negative experience. But for some kids, they get the best of both parents when they're separated and they're not actually in the midst of, an unhappy relationship, but they actually see the brilliance of both and can appreciate the difference and the brilliance in both. Carol, any final tips? If someone's listening to this and they're going through a divorce and they've got pets in the mix, what would you say to them?
Well, don't forget that they're experiencing this separation as well. Involve them in your discussions about, who's going to care for the pet, who's going to pay for the pet's care as well, which is really important, and the what ifs. So, what's going to happen when the pet passes away. So include your pet in the discussions and don't fall out about it. If you need help, reach out and have a facilitated discussion.
Thank you. And Sam, from you, any final tips for anyone listening going through this at the moment?
I think I would just say to people that, if they get to a point where sadly the only decision that they can come to is to potentially relinquish that pet into rescue, then I would say to them not to feel guilty about that and not to blame themselves for having to do that. There are absolutely circumstances where it's incredibly difficult and that's the best outcome for the pet. So they shouldn't feel like they're going to be judged. It's really important that if they get to that point, they reach out to a reputable rescue so that they've got the help there that they need.
That's a really good point, because a lot of people have to move into rented when they divorce. It might be a while before they can buy a property. You might not be allowed to have an animal in a rented place. So there are lots of reasons, as you say, and it doesn't help anyone to feel guilty about those things. So thank you. That's a really valuable point. Where can people find out more about this, Sam?
So people can visit the RSPCA's website, which is www.rspca.org.uk. We've got a whole range of advice and information around just general care, but also what people can do if they're struggling with their pet's health or their pet's behaviour.
Thank you. And Carol, what if people want a session with Amicable?
So go to amicable.co.uk.
Brilliant. And you can book a 90-minute pet session there, can't you? Fabulous. It's been fascinating talking to you both. Thank you very much indeed for your time today. Really enjoyed this one. And we'll put all the information in the show notes too. Thanks both for joining me. If you've enjoyed listening to this and you'd like to subscribe to the podcast, you can go to thedivorcepodcast.com or you can subscribe on your favourite listening platforms. Finally, we'd love to know how we can help more. So please share your questions on divorce, separation and co-parenting with us at hello@amicable.co.uk. You never know, they might be the topic of the next episode. Thank you for listening.